Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, Mo, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour and their website analyticshour.io. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 94. In marketing and digital groups all across this great land of ours, and yes, I mean the earth, all too often we get so excited about the great A/B testing and optimization tool that we just bought. And we get it all set up, we run a few tests, and then, interest wanes. And 2 years later, when it's time to renew, we're just looking at each other like, well, what should we do? Well, the reality is there's a lot of work that's required to scale your program. And so that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. And in a new test format, let's introduce you to our hosts.
Hey, I'm Tim Wilson. I'm the elderly director of analytics at Search Discovery.
And I'm Mo Kiss. I'm a youthful analyst over at The Iconic.
And I'm the somewhat middle-aged Michael Helbling. All right. Jury's out on that one, guys. Okay. But in addition to us, we needed a guest, somebody with a lot of experience with this topic. And it just so happened Mo met the perfect person at the Yao Data Conference over in Sydney, Australia. Andrea Burbank is a data scientist at Pinterest, where she's held many different roles across that organization as it's grown from 50 people to now over 1,000. Prior to that, she was part of the PowerSet team and then was acquired by Microsoft and spent some time there. But now she's our guest. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I think a great way to get started is just sort of, how did you end up in the role that you're in, and how did you kind of end up in the experimentation and testing area, and sort of maybe some of the things that you experienced along the way?
Yeah, I think two different things happened to sort of kick that off. I joined Pinterest almost exactly 6 years ago in July 2012, and we were working on changing the categories we showed to users. So should it be animals and tattoos and art, or history and vacations and travel, or whatever else? And we shipped that the first week of the London Olympics. And we didn't really have an A/B testing platform. And then our metrics went down a lot. And we had no idea categories not helping our users, or are people actually off watching the Olympics? And so we said, gee, it sure looks like A/B testing is something we should invest in. And so we did. And we sort of had an A/B testing framework that was limping along and semi-functional. And so the next thing that happened was that I went to actually use it for our next launch, which was changing how we onboarded new users. But our A/B testing framework at that point randomized all the users who showed up every day, so you couldn't test something specifically on new users, and then it only measured the outcomes when they actually showed up, so you couldn't measure a lot of other things we wanted to measure. And so as I realized that I couldn't measure the thing I was building, I started building out the A/B testing framework. And then once I'd built it, it turned out it was useful for a lot of other things. So that was sort of how it happened.
Was that a homegrown A/B testing, or was that a third-party tool?
It's always been a homegrown one for us. I mean, really, all you need for A/B testing is to randomize users and then write down what you randomize them into and then track some stuff. And since we already were logging things.
And be able to crunch the numbers in a responsible way, although
Sure.
Some would say maybe the third-party tools don't actually help you do that. But
yeah, so we had sort of a user hashing system. And we'd implemented logging on Pinterest something like a few months before that, because we had grown really quickly in 2011, 2012. And so we had very simple randomized users. We wrote down which group every user was in on each request. And then we could count how many repins happened, how many clicks happened, how many visits happened. So very basic in-house.
And as you were kind of on this, I hate saying the word journey, it's so corny, but as you were kind of down this path of, okay, I need this experimentation because it's ultimately going to help me do my job, how did you learn the right and the wrong way to do things? Was it just trial and error? Did you try and educate yourself as you went? I don't know, because I think sometimes it is tough with experimentation where you learn so much by making a mistake, but then you also don't want that mistake to be replicated by other teams.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I think in some ways I was a little bit lucky in terms of where I started out. because I was working on the new user onboarding experience, things like novelty effect were super important, and so they were very top of mind, even though maybe if I'd been working on the experimentation framework with another application in mind, I wouldn't have thought of that until later. But because with onboarding, there's such a big drop-off after the first day, I knew, okay, I'm going to expose users on the first day, but what I really care about is, are they coming back to Pinterest more a week later?
Yeah, nice.
And then I think we did make a bunch of experiments up front, which actually helped strengthen sort of the culture of experimentation. I think A/B testing can have a bad name of like, why are you running experiments on your users? Isn't that unethical? And I think the counterpoint to that is, well, we're always building something for our users based on our best guess. And this way we get to actually validate our best guess. The alternative to experimentation isn't that everything stays exactly the way everyone would like it. The alternative is we ship things and have no idea what you like or hate. And so hopefully by running experiments we can. But one of the early things we shipped, we hadn't really thought about, well, what if it doesn't work? How will we back out of that? And so that led to sort of pretty strong buy-in from all sides of the company of, we need to be thoughtful about what we're going to experiment on, make sure we're never intentionally shipping anything that hurts users, but also think up front of like, if our hypothesis is wrong, that this will be helpful, how will we make sure that the users who were exposed can be sort of reintegrated into the normal experience without any harm?
Particularly in those early days where the culture kind of wasn't at the same point that it's at now, what was the business like when things did fail? I mean, there are often tests that are inconclusive or there are no results. And I mean, what was the attitude around that, particularly as you were kind of trying to get people to understand the importance of testing?
I mean, I think I was really trying to drive testing as a tool for sort of figuring out which way to drive. So we tried out sort of 5 really different onboarding experiences. And even if one turns out better in some ways than others, at least we can eliminate 3 of these ideas. Because we were pretty new. We had an orientation that someone had built at some point, but we had no idea if it was a reasonable choice. And so the goal wasn't necessarily that every change we made would, triple our sign-up conversion rate or whatever else, but that it would give us an idea of what sorts of directions were worth pursuing. And so I think by framing it as a tool for learning, people were less invested in, oh gosh, shall we ship this today? Oh no, are the metrics, etc.
Well, in a kind of perverse sort of way, was it the fact that you had something got rolled out, not tested, and was a problem? Did that wind up kind of buying you future patience with tests? Like if people feel like everything's going fine and you try to introduce testing, they're like, well, everything's working fine. We're doing okay. We roll things out. Things stay flat or things get better and we're good. Whereas it sounded like you kind of had the perverse gift of a little bit of a crisis where things weren't good and they're like, well, shoot, why? Is this because of an external factor or was it because of what we rolled out? Like that seems like it could actually have for some period of time, bought you some ability to say, yeah, we need to test this stuff because we want to not have that happen again. But that's me totally projecting. I have no idea if that's how it actually played out.
I think it's exactly right. I think it wasn't as powerful as it sounds like it could be. And I think some experiences like that could be for some organizations at some times. For us, it was one of 20 things we were doing in parallel, and we kind of decided to do it anyway. And we were just trying to make it more reasonable based on some other things. We weren't super concerned about the metrics. We mostly wanted to make sure we weren't breaking anything terribly. And then, you watch and 2 weeks later, the Olympics end and everyone comes back and everyone's all happy. But I do think the idea of sort of a catalyzing story that helps people understand why A/B testing is valuable is really important. I did some of that internally just by showing, okay, which of these 2 designs do you think will be better from some of Ronnie Kohavi's examples that he's done. And everyone votes wrong, and nobody votes right on all 3 examples. And you say, okay, given that you're always wrong and guessing which design will be better, let's think.
I don't think I ever really thought about that as kind of keeping in the back of your mind, trying to get testing rolling if you actually do have a minor or an unpleasant, crisis. And that could be a landing page on a campaign. It could be, it could be a new feature rolled out because everybody sort of mobilizes and runs after let's address that now. There's maybe the opportunity for someone to say, okay, we got to get through the immediate crisis, but now let me use that to feed into a story to say, hey, and part of our postmortem of how we could have avoided that could have been, through testing.
So I think even though the Olympics thing wasn't a huge catalyst for us, we did have one of those sort of lucky confluences that convinced everyone to do testing. I guess lucky might not be the right word because it was sort of a Andrea forced confluence where we decided to do testing, but we were redesigning our whole website, and it was the sort of thing where you've committed a lot of resources to it. So I think we had devoted 20% of our engineers for 6 months to redoing the whole thing from the bottom up. And so we were absolutely going to ship it no matter what. But I kept saying we should run an A/B test anyway because we want to know when the metrics change, hey, remember the Olympics back then, if that's due to this redesign. And so we'd like to know what size effect to expect from the redesign. And because I kept pushing for that, we ended up running that test and ended up finding some pretty severe regressions in a lot of the metrics we cared about that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And because this was such a huge sort of company investment we'd made at such a long scale, and yet we ended up pushing it out further because of A/B testing, that sort of brought the A/B testing framework and its capabilities to the forefront of everyone's minds. And people said, oh, geez, it's valuable that we learned these things before we pushed it out.
So in that case, you actually delayed the full launch. I mean, it had been launched to some users, but so you delayed it, said, let's figure out what's going on there.
Right. The original plan was like roll out to 5% one day and then 20% the next day and then 100% the next day. I said, well, why don't we keep it at 5% for a few days and look at the metrics? The metrics are way down, this sort of thing.
So did you take it back down to 0 and then address things and then?
So we didn't, in part because we wanted to see, well, we still had enough users that we could roll other people in once we thought it was fixed. But we also wanted to see as our fixes went out, where was people's behavior changing? And also it wasn't that the experience was horribly broken, right? It basically worked in most of the ways, but some functionality was gone. And we wanted to see as we added that back in, did people use it?
So where did, when things were not working, was it a matter of saying, well, these metrics are being impacted, let's sit with the UX, figure out why that might be going, or did you, how did you then take it to the next level of actually figuring out what the root cause in the change?
At the time, it was honestly super stressful because here I was sort of opposing this moving ship of this very important product. But I think it did lead to a lot of really good discussions of, okay, this metric is down. Is it because we made this button red? Is it because we moved this from the sidebar to the bottom? Is it because, and so I still have the docs of like 8 different hypotheses we had for why this metric was down, and then the subsequent experiments we ran where we tried reintroducing all those things or moving buttons around or changing button colors to see which of them was having the effect. And so we learned a lot about sort of how users were using Pinterest that we didn't already know, and also managed to not ship this thing that was removing a feature that it turned out people cared about that we hadn't realized.
It does sound like you had a very good culture around you, though, because, I mean, there are some companies that once the ship starts in that direction, you can tell them anything in the world about why it's wrong or right. And they're like, but the ship's going that way. There ain't no turning it around. And it does sound like you were.
Well, they would say users will get used to it. So your A/B test is no good because you're testing and we're changed, and that's what's caused it. Customer satisfaction went down because we made a change, but it will recover. But it sounds like you didn't. So you didn't really have any of that, or
I have heard all those stories many times. Okay. I think our leadership at Pinterest has always been very thoughtful and really, really, really cares about our users. And so when we could say, hey, it seems like maybe users are trying to do something and failing, or maybe it's really not working the way people expect it to, that they really care about. Like, we don't want to tell a story of, well, in 6 months, everyone will be fine and they'll be used to it. We were trying to redesign it to make it intuitive. And so to the extent that we were failing, we wanted to at least try to make it better. We weren't going to not ship, but we were willing to push the ship out a little bit to try to improve that experience.
I do also really like that idea, that the concept you were talking about like do no harm to your users. This is not about, like it's right or it's wrong. It's like what's in the best interest of our users. And I think when you can frame your A/B tests around like we're looking after our customers, I assume that would help with like buy-in, and that's a pretty hard argument to fight with, I guess.
I think it's a hard argument to fight with, but both sides get to use it.
Yeah.
So we said, well, by pushing this out, we're also delaying the shipment of these other features, which rely on the new framework. And so it's a constant trade-off. And so we did ship, I think, with our metrics still a little bit down, but instead of 40% down, which is kind of ginormous, it was like, 2% down. And we kind of understood what was driving it, that sort of thing. And that way we weren't gating these features anymore. So you try to do the things that's best for users, but only by measuring it can you really have a guess of what that is.
It makes me curious, just as part of the evolution of an organization and their ability to test or having a culture, around optimization. Is there a turning point where the analyst isn't going to feel like they're that person in opposition to some big moving thing? Or does the organization start to embrace that more holistically? And I'm curious because you actually sit in a really great spot, Andrea. I think having seen a small organization become a big organization and be seeing this all along the way, were there times where, like that first time, felt stressful, your words being kind of in opposition to this big moving ship, if you will, this big initiative? Does it still feel that way? Or is it now kind of like, no, we're all on board the same thing and now testing is, and where was that switch?
I think that's a really good question. I think first switch came sort of from the value we demonstrated from that first really stressful pressure cooker of this rewrite. Like the whole company's attention was on it. We showed how running the A/B test had actually been really valuable. And then we had pretty high-level executive buy-in for, okay, we should be running tests on sort of anything we think is a substantial change to the service. I don't know how to answer your question about if you can avoid that first part of like being the only person in the way, because that's how it happened. And I don't know if you can get buy-in first, but
it's almost like you have to have somebody be that champion, if you will, wherever they sit in the organization. And I think it's great if that person is sitting way, way high up in the organization saying, this is how we're going to run things. But a lot of times, I think a lot of analysts and people sitting down doing the work are those first people to kind of raise their hands and be like, hey, we've got to find a better way. And
yeah, I mean, I was pretty junior and a pretty new hire at the time. And I sort of just decided to stick my neck out and say, I think this is really important. And of course, it could have been that the A/B test showed nothing and everything was fine, but then it also would have been lower stakes.
Sure.
Because we would have just shipped it and it wouldn't have been as stressful. So
yeah,
it kind of works out.
Well, and I do think, I mean, Pinterest having, I'll just in the scale of, let's just call it massive scale from users, and it's very, very consumer focused. And you sort of alluded to kind of multiple times already that there were also kind of key metrics identified that the organization rallied around. As I think through some of the experiences I've had with organizations that really kind of, and you also said that it's homegrown. So you started with kind of the need and you just figured out a way to kind of get to it. To me, what I have seen more often is stakes are lower. Somebody sees a vendor talk, so they kind of jump to buying a tool and saying, I get the idea of testing. We should be doing testing. And maybe the analyst saying, we should be doing testing. We should be doing testing. But then when you say, well, what are we going to test? Like, what are we grappling with? What significant changes are we making to the user experience? And really struggling. I mean, I've had multiple clients that have bought a testing tool first and then literally just cannot come up with ideas that they're willing and able or even interested in testing. So I sort of feel like it's a totally different kind of challenge because it's very tempting a lot of times for us to say everybody should be testing. And I'm like, well, there's the culture of accepting testing, but then there's kind of also do you have enough people with independent thought and hypothesizing and ideas and changes being made often enough in order to make that worthwhile?
Right.
I feel like we have the opposite problem. Our company's like, let's test everything. And you're like, whoa, hold back a minute. Like, only test the stuff if you're going to make a decision off it. If you're going to ship it regardless, there is no point in testing it. Well, from my perspective.
Well, but what's similar with, and what Pinterest and the Iconic have in common is that both are pretty much pure play online. You know, the transactional, whatever the transaction is occurring online. So I think there is a commonality, even though those are, one's a community, one is a product company. I don't know. I feel like because there's the scaling, like what Andrea, I think you had to go through was it sort of took off and you championed it and pushed it and made it happen. And then you said, oh, now I got to scale this up. And how do we do this where we don't just kind of descend into chaos where there's like no organization and plan? Hopefully we'll get to that as well, because I think you've got some great thoughts on kind of checklists and sort of where the bottlenecks are. But I think it's also kind of responsible to point out that you've got to have the right factors that say, hey, we're ready to move into testing, or you're going to be, it's not even really culture. Maybe it's cultural or structural or business model or something else.
Well, and do you have metrics that you can measure relatively quickly so that you can get quick results on your A/B tests and iterate quickly, which is usually the goal of running a lot of these.
Yeah. Do you have a meaningful outcome that's low latency that you could actually get to something?
As you started ramping up your A/B testing efforts, did you find that each test was using fairly consistent metrics, or was it like completely different metrics depending on what you were testing?
We had only implemented about, 40 or 50 metrics that were tracked automatically. So everyone was sort of constrained to using those ones. You could always run custom queries, but it was, most people don't want to run SQL queries or Hive queries when they could look at a dashboard. I think it was also pretty early days, so we could only detect changes of a certain size, and it actually was reasonable to expect that your change to onboarding would get 10% more users to come back, or would increase repins by 2 or 3%. And so it was fairly coarse, but it met our needs.
So is your analytics also homegrown? I should know that. And
when you say our analytics,
your
and we'll use Kafka to log things. Yeah, we don't have like Google Analytics or anything. We have front-end client logging, and we log to Kafka, and then we aggregate things.
Which is, so because you've got users logging in, so it sounds like you've got that, and then it almost, because there's like an upside to having that in-house built behavioral tracking and logging, is that it presumably sort of forced some discipline around what actually matters, what do we really care about. It'll make the Adobe and Google people, cringe horribly, but you're like, hey, these are the metrics we have. We're tracking these because they mattered. Therefore, when you're testing, it's integrated, tied into that.
Right. Again, and I think one of the challenges with, some of the tools like Optimizely 6 years ago was that the outcomes you had to measure had to be fairly immediate and fairly sort of front-end oriented. Like, did people click the sign up button might be your success metric. And for us, it was much more about saving content they're interested in from a variety of surfaces on Pinterest. And so either we would have to hook these external tools up to our internal databases somehow, or honestly, since we were already tracking all these things, all you have to do is join the user ID in the experiment, the user ID who took the action, and you can do all the analytics yourself. So
can you talk to us about the point you got to? Like, you've gone on this incredible journey. Of A/B testing, but then you got to some point where you're like, okay, I can't be the only person in the company doing this. What did that look like?
It looked like me being really stressed out and having to do a lot of code reviews and not getting anything else done. And I think I was on a team of 3, and the other people on the team sort of saw this happening. And so I said to them, like, I just can't do this. Like, what can we do instead? And so together we came up with this idea of me training them to do what I did, which required me to write down all the things I was thinking about. And then once I had that written down, we said, okay, well, now that 3 of us understand it, and we've written everything down and clarified your notes and so on, we can spread that beyond the 3 of us and try to get people across the whole team to work on it.
And what were the buckets of what you were writing down? I mean, how much was this is the sequence of steps? How much was identifying a good experiment? How much was these are the mechanics of not screwing something up?
Yeah, so basically I had set up a email filter that would move to my inbox anything whenever anyone was changing an experiment. And I would just poke my nose in on the code review and look at how they'd set it up and try to get them to not screw things up. So what that looked like was me writing down basically all of the screw-ups I'd seen and what had happened. And then we started thinking about how you would avoid them. So people thought they were allocating 5% groups, but they were actually allocating 0.5% groups or 4% groups. Or people would ramp up and then ramp down because they realized they'd broken something, but then they'd put those same users back in the next day without realizing that, like, maybe having the site be broken for 2 hours yesterday while you were testing would affect the metrics today for those same people, this sort of thing.
And so when people were reading, and particularly your colleagues were reading all of these, I guess, common mistakes that had been made, did they get it right away, or did they have to kind of, as they were learning, make some of those mistakes themselves for it to actually really sink in?
So that was where we tried to sort of turn this list of mistakes I'd seen into a checklist of how would you anticipate those mistakes. And then we also turned our sort of training program into a apprenticeship. So you were actually on the hook for looking at all of the experiments going out on Pinterest and looking at the code reviews the same way I had and trying to catch those mistakes. Because it's one thing to theoretically know, okay, these things might happen. It's another to be told, hey, Andrea, like, I know you looked at that code review for the French experiment, but you didn't notice that it actually wasn't restricted to users speaking French. Like, see how that's here on the checklist. How can we make that more clear so it doesn't happen? This sort of thing. Not in a confrontational way, but in a, we all want to try to run experiments that aren't either messing the user experience up or that throw away all of our hard work. And so what can we do to keep improving these checklists to make fewer things fall through the gaps?
Oh, I just feel like I need to read Atul Gawande's book.
It's so good.
I'm such a fan of checklists.
Well, and it's fascinating because
I feel like I'm like, what's he going to tell me? Like, it seems so obvious.
Right.
Like, yes, of course, checklists.
It's like surgeons and pilots who have years and years of advanced training, and yet having these simple checklists of did you count the scalpels on the table before and did you count the scalpels on the table after turns out to improve outcomes dramatically. And so what we are doing is much lower stakes, thankfully, than flying an airplane or doing surgery, and much, much simpler. But even so, just reminding people of the things they need to check and giving them a simple thing to work through as they're doing a code review proved to be really valuable.
And you had a few different checklists, correct?
We did. So basically, we made an analogy between running an experiment and flying a plane, which, again, oversimplified, I would much rather run an experiment than fly a plane. But basically, for every experiment, there's some point when you start it, there's some point when it's already running and you might want to change it, and then there's some point when you think you want to end it. And the pitfalls at each of those stages are different. And so at the start, a lot of the things we wanted people to check for were, did you write down what your hypotheses are? Are you triggering the experiment in the right place? Did you write down what your experiment does and what each treatment group actually does? And then partway through, it's, does your experiment look like it's doing what it's supposed to? Are you ramping up the groups because you actually need more power, or do you already have enough statistical power and you could just wait a week? These sorts of things. And then at the end, do you have enough data to make a decision? Are you making the right decision? Were there pre-existing differences in your groups that sort of negate your decision? These sorts of things.
Wow. I think that's because you've also inherently baked in onboarding for additional resources, as well as some ability to kind of govern like a process that's being governed, which means that you don't have to do some massive knowledge transfer. And I think the airplane analogy is awesome. Like, because I feel like it does seem like in testing, you have to fight against the people who say, well, look at the test every day and just end it when we've hit significance. And everybody at this point hopefully knows that's not good. And then you have we decided we're going to run it for 2 weeks. We're not going to look at it at all, in which we did our calculations, in which case they may say, oops, we actually screwed it up. We should have been able to identify that the test was not working as intended 2 days in and corrected. But now, we've kind of gone nuts. So shifting a little bit, and maybe I'm not super clear on it, kind of exactly what your role and the other two people on your team, that when it comes from an analyst side of the organization, I've seen people think, hey, I'm an analyst. I know how to crunch the data and I just need to get a tool and I'm set, and kind of underestimating the need for UX and creative resources as well as for development and IT resources. Did you run into that at all? That like you can't just scale necessarily just more of you need you and the other parties that are involved.
Right. I think we never had a shortfall of ideas of things we wanted to try building. And so we had UX engineers who were already planning to build this new experience. It was just a matter of getting them to build experimentation into that. And so I would help with coding that part or helping them set up that part. But I didn't need to try to convince people that we should run a test on building this thing. We were already planning to build a different search relevance engine or a different UI for pin close-up or whatever else it was.
But did it open up to where they were already building a new experience, but instead of building a new experience, they would build a couple variations of the new experience?
Sometimes. I think one thing we learned from this huge redesign was that when you lump together 3,000 different changes, it's really hard to tell which of them made the difference in your metric. And so sometimes we would work with them and say, hey, you're changing a lot of different things here. Maybe you should add another treatment that isn't the one you're planning to ship, but that's sort of an intermediate in between them, so you know which of these two big things you're changing was more important.
And is that the sort of thing that a multivariate test in theory, you'd chunk up those different things and be able to do your partial factorial or whatever magic?
Bonferroni correction, etc.
Oh, Bonferroni correction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of complexities that people can get really hung up on with multivariate testing. To be honest, Pinterest is really lucky in that we have a lot of users. And as I said early on, like a lot of the changes we were making had a pretty big impact. So we didn't have to worry too much about a lot of the details of that. It was much more valuable to just try a couple things out and you would see 5%, 10% differences between them. And then with, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of users, and then the Bonferroni correction changes your p-value from 0.00001 to 0.00002, and you don't care.
Well, but so given that you've got so much scale, do you set kind of a minimum length on the test to say I at least need to go to a 1 week I need to cycle through a weekend, even though that's going to give us more? I guess, do you control we're going to do 5%? We don't need to do a 50-50 split because we're swimming in users.
We definitely almost never do a 50-50 split. We do try to get people to run for at least a week, both because our usage and users vary a lot by day of week, but also because a lot of what we care about is sort of long-term effects. And especially for UI changes, as you said, sometimes they take a while to settle in. But even for relevance changes, one analogy I make is like, let's say we figured out the best 20 recipes for pie, and you search for pie, and we show those 20 results to you, like you're pretty happy. But then if you come back the next day and search for pie and get exactly the same results, now you're not very happy anymore because you were hoping to get some variety or at least be able to scroll down and see different things. And so I think things like novelty effects matter for a whole lot of different experiences, even if it's not, I change the button and everyone clicks it because they don't know what it is, even if it's much more back end, understanding what the effects are over a longer period was really important to us. That's always a struggle, right? Like Pinterest probably like everywhere else, always wants to move quickly, always wants to ship something and move on. Sometimes we'll do that via longer term holdouts or whatever else, but we do try really hard to get people to wait for anything where we think that effect might be important.
No, the challenge of novelty effects, that's actually, because I think a lot of times we think, no, we want to find the right experience and we want it repeated. But I mean, you're kind of like a news media site in that sense that I don't want to keep going back to a news site and keep seeing the same headline, 4 hours later. Wow, that's got to be another fun challenge. Yeah.
It's a real challenge. Like we're trying to balance the things you're most interested in, which you'll repin the most.
Or the flip side is I saw that cool thing. I didn't pin it. Let me go back and find it again. And if you have too much variety, then they're like, I know it was here. I just didn't have time to pin it.
And if we only show you sweet potato gnocchi, like, yes, I love sweet potato gnocchi, but there's only so many ways to prepare that. So how do we sort of introduce more diversity into your feed of like people who like sweet potato gnocchi might also like charred enchiladas or whatever else?
Wow. I love gnocchi and I hate sweet potatoes. So I'm not.
Oh, you're missing out.
Oh my God. It sounds healthy. A lot of vitamin B.
Not when you put the brown butter sage sauce on it.
Oh. So I've been thinking as we've been talking, and this is maybe even just a question for all of us to ponder. So obviously Pinterest as a platform, as a website, you guys aren't necessarily trying to get people to do something beyond sort of use the product and use the various functionality, which could be construed as a little bit different, say, than compared to like what Mo's doing at The Iconic, which is they want people to buy products and they're trying to merchandise specific things. Do you feel there's a difference in the way that people perceive or approach testing? If it's sort of, how do we enhance sort of our product, which is the website itself, versus how do we get people to buy products which are displayed on the website?
I actually disagree a little bit with your premise.
Nice.
That's good. No, that's good.
Well, so Pinterest's mission is to help people discover and do things they love.
Okay.
And so we actually have a lot of data about things like spend more time on the site, whether that's a positive outcome or not, because we do want people to find the right recipe and go out and make it, or figure out how to build their coffee table and go out and build it. So we do have sort of metrics around click-throughs and purchases as well. Retailers who link back to us and say we can attribute this purchase to Pinterest, or just we know this user bought something after having used Pinterest, those sorts of things.
Right.
So it is maybe more action-oriented than you perhaps think.
Okay. Well, yeah. And that's me not knowing a lot about how everybody uses Pinterest because I use it very sparingly.
I think Pinterest is also interesting in that way because I think everyone uses it really different ways.
Yeah.
So I use it a lot for cooking, and I'm thinking a lot about how we can improve that, but other people use it just for fashion or just for collecting beautiful photos of places they want to travel. And so when we think about the metrics of our A/B tests, we have to think about, I talked a little about how we have millions of users, it's not a problem. That's a bit glib on my part because we have millions of users, but we want to be helpful to both people in Japan and people in the US, and also people who use it to collect beautiful pictures and don't really care where they link, versus people who are doing recipes and really want to be able to click through to things and find good stuff. So just all these different use cases and segments of people we try to keep in mind and understand what metrics we can develop that will help us know if we're improving the product for them.
That is super interesting, though, that the idea that you would have such different segments that could use the same product for completely different purpose. Like, to be honest, I've never thought about using it for recipes, and now that's going to be my thing that I do later today.
Andrea has an entire board that is nothing but sweet potato gnocchi recipes. It's pages and pages long.
But actually, there was something you said in there which I really think it was a big takeaway, which is you guys spent a lot of time thinking about what would be the best way for a user to use the product or platform. Is it best for them to spend a lot of time, or is spending a lot of time, does it hit its maximum and now it becomes a detriment? And so I thought that was really good because I think sometimes it's hard to sort of be like, oh yeah, we want to make this metric go up, 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 up without kind of thinking about if there's a cliff that you can go over that might not be optimal anymore.
Well, and we think a lot also about sort of not getting the number of repins, the number of clicks to go up, because there are people who just are on Pinterest all the time. What we really care about is making it useful to you for whatever you want to use it for, making it useful for more people. So the people who repin, people who click is often our key metric as opposed to absolute number of repins or clicks, because it's much easier to get someone from their 1,000th repin to their 1,001st than from their 0th to their first. But there's a lot more sort of user value in that very first one of, oh, I finally understand what this weird Pinterest thing is, and I found something I like, and I want to save it for later.
So do you guys have a North Star metric? I'm like really, I've become obsessed about this ever since I discovered that Airbnb have like this North Star metric, and every test, everything in the company is kind of aligned to that. And I really like the idea, but I just like in a use case like Pinterest where everyone's using it for different purposes, I feel like that would be really tough.
I think it is really tough. To be candid, probably each year or 2 or 3 we switch what the North Star metric is, but they're all oriented around the same idea, which is, as I said, our mission is helping people discover and do things they love. So sometimes we think that's more click-throughs, sometimes we think that's more saving for later, but the basic idea is we at least want people to be doing one or both of those things. And so our North Star metric is something like repins or click-throughers, or repins or click-throughs, depending on sort of the flavor of the year or two. But I think it's also, we do track it for every experiment, and you absolutely can't decrease it by much. But a lot of things you do won't necessarily move that North Star metric, because it is, millions of users, and all you're doing is changing how we treat 5-word search queries, right? And so figuring out the smaller metrics that are directionally aligned with the North Star is often as valuable as knowing what that North Star is.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Jumping off of that, I assume that there is massive scale on mobile apps as well as on massive scale on the website. The actual balance is neither one of them is immaterial. So where do you wind up in the mobile app testing world as well? Is that similarly, are there unique challenges there? Did that come later?
Yeah, that's a good question. It did come a few months later. I guess summer 2012 was when I implemented our A/B testing framework on web. For the app, you need to think about sort of latency to the API, where you don't want it to have to wait for the API to reply to get the experiment groups. So we implemented that it would fetch it at the beginning and then have a sort of asynchronous callback to say when the user had triggered into one of the groups and so on. It's evolved now some, so I think the clients actually can do the bucketing locally with the same hashing logic as we have on the back end. Many of our tests run across all platforms simultaneously. That can be tricky because the release schedules are obviously different. It used to be that for fast prototyping, we would often do things web only, because obviously you can ship the web in 30 seconds as opposed to waiting for the App Store to approve your new version. But because so much of our traffic has moved to mobile, We now do many more tests that are mobile only, see how it looks on one of our platforms, either iOS or Android. And then
so wait, I've got to ask. So how, because this is exactly what we do. We test on web because apps are just too hard. And it's like, how do you time our iOS developers changes to be in sync with the Android, and then iOS always takes longer to approve? Like, how are you doing this? Are you timing them, like running them for different periods, or are you basically, you wait until you get iOS approval and then everything goes?
So often we'll test it on whichever platform is ready first, but build in sort of two experiments. So one will be iOS blue button and one will be Android blue button, but then there'll also be a blue button. And so if you're in either iOS blue button or blue button, we measure on the iOS one, make sure everything looks reasonable. And then when we're ready, we can sort of switch over to that parent experiment to make sure that the consistency across platforms is enforced.
Okay, so this is a really naffed question, but I've got to ask. So we've done the same a few times. And then when it comes to analyzing your results, because there's always this question then of like, is the result different on Android to iOS? And should you be checking that, or should you be combining them all? Because ultimately they've all been exposed to a blue button. How have you been managing that?
We manage it two ways. The easiest way is that our dashboard lets you split the results by platform that the action happened on. So you can look at whether repins on Android are down or up versus on iOS. That works pretty well because most people don't switch devices all that much. But you can also break it down. We have a R script that we run by the platform on which they were first exposed and do the same thing. And so then you know that there's no sort of cross-platform switching that's messing things up. Like if everyone switches to their iPhone because the experience is so terrible on Android, you'll see that in those metrics.
Nice.
There's a lot of complicated questions like this of how do you figure out what segments are important to look at? Once you're looking at 20 segments, of course, some of them have statistically significant differences that are spurious. Like, it gets more and more complicated for sure. And I think at the start you said, now that you've solved the experiment culture problem. No, we have not solved by any stretch of the imagination the experiment culture problem.
Once you get your culture wrapped up, then you can start tackling the hard problems.
Well, that's one of the things I say is like, if you build the right tools, I think the hard thing is getting people to be thoughtful. Why am I running this? What will it do? What do I expect it to change? Can I measure that thing? And tools can't really help with those things. They can help you move faster and see metrics faster and detect anomalies faster and realize you've bucketed people wrong faster. And so to the extent we can build tools that do all the things tools can do, then we can use our brains and our time to try to get people to be more thoughtful about why they're doing these things and how they'll measure success.
Oh, that's great. All right, we have got to wrap up because we are running out of time and this conversation is really, really good. Okay, so one of the things we love to do on the show is called the last call. It's where we go around and we just mention something we found recently that we think is interesting or we think people might find interesting. So, Andrea, you're our guest. Would you like to go first?
So this is not super analytical.
That's okay.
But some guy on the internet is using Canvas and generative statistics to make posters for the World Cup. And I am a big soccer fan. And so he makes these really cool graphics where it shows how many goals were scored by which teams and when. And it comes out in an art form to represent the soccer game, which I think is pretty cool. And you can Google generative World Cup posters Canvas and you'll find them. But they're very neat. I love soccer. I love statistics. So
nice.
That's my thing for the week.
And we already know that won the World Cup, so that's pretty exciting.
Based on when this was recorded.
Okay.
Although I think we had Ben Gaines on a couple years ago, who's at Adobe Analytics product manager there, just to talk about sports analytics, and he's a big NBA fan. But I can see a glorious return of Andrea for a discussion of
soccer analytics. All right. Tim, you want to go next?
Sure. Mine's kind of also sort of fun. So a couple weeks ago, I pushed out my explanation of distributions and binomial metrics in video form on our site. This is not meant to be a log roll for that because that's already up. But And I did that whole thing in an XKCD format, and is the course of just checking some things on the XKCD front. I found the explainxkcd.com. There's an entire wiki that basically explains every single XKCD comment, or it's like at 80% of them, which is just kind of fascinating. Intrigued by it. It's funny in its own right. The fact that Randall Munroe has the level of following that there's an entire site that just explains his comics, which most of them I genuinely explain, but it's just a fun little site to poke around. And it also has some very useful sort of categorization of the comics as well. I think that's how I wound up at it, is that I was looking for a specific comic topic, and I found it on explainxkcd.com.
Very nice. All right, Mo, what do you got?
Okay, I'm going to just slowly change people's lives, like one tiny trick at a time. So...
This is the latest BigQuery shortcut you've got?
Yes, it is. It changed my life. So I migrated from Legacy SQL to Standard SQL a while back, and despite all of my ranting and raving, it doesn't seem like the Google Cloud team is going to change the default from Legacy SQL to Standard.
They know you have a podcast, right, Mo?
Anyway, what I did discover from them is a trick that apparently all of the Googlers know about, which is that if you do like a hash and then Standard SQL at the start of all of your code, it will always automatically run Standard SQL instead of Legacy.
So you do hash and then just Standard SQL, one string?
So yeah, basically you just do hash and then you write Standard SQL. It doesn't matter if it's caps or lowercase, and you put it at the first line of all of your code. Any comments have to be below it. It literally has to be the first line, and it will always run even if you have the Legacy SQL box ticked. And this blew my mind, and it's been pretty amazing. But I also have a tiny twofer, because the other one that I want to do is just a shout out, because the YOW conference where Andrea and I met have two conferences coming up, one in Perth and one in Singapore. And they're basically conferences and workshops for developers by developers. So there's one in Perth in Australia, September 5 to 6, and there's also one in Singapore on September 8. And they've still got early bird tickets available.
Outstanding. Okay. My last call is my new Pinterest board called Analytics Podcasts, where I'm capturing... Oh, no, I'm just kidding. I did create one while we were on the show today, but that's not really it. So I recently read an article by a guy by the name of Niels Hoven, who's a product manager, and he was talking about how, as he ran product management for some mobile game companies over the last 10 years, and noticed how data and analytics could sometimes take over and create what he called sort of a misrepresentation of what you should actually do to capitalize on pleasing users and deliver the right experience through mobile games. And so things like paywalls and how often you put up advertising and all these things were all being optimized by the data because it drove revenue or other targets, but actually created negative outcomes in the life cycle of the apps that they would be managing. So it was a really good article. It was called Stop Letting the Data Decide. So I actually found it really interesting and not too off topic from what we were just talking about on the show. So definitely check that out. It's very thoughtful writing. Okay. We obviously did not nearly cover enough on this journey, or should I say walkabout, Mo, through understanding what it takes to scale experimentation and a culture of testing. But it was a great discussion. We would love to hear from you. And the best way to reach us is through the Measure Slack, or you can reach us through our Facebook page or our website or on Twitter. And Andrea, thank you again for being on the show and sharing your knowledge with us and our listeners. You have a wealth of information, so thank you for sharing it. We're wisdom on your long trek through experimentation. See, there's lots of synonyms, Mo. Lots of them. Your voyage. Anyways, but yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. And I know that I speak for both my co-hosts, Mo and Tim, when I tell all of you out there, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io, facebook.com/analyticshour, or at analyticshour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
We bring a lot of imposter syndrome to this podcast, Andrea, so.
I have so much of that, I should fit right in.
Yeah, no, it's,
Yeah, Michael will likely illustrate how to not do a hard stop before starting. You'll see me have a little minor stroke, correct him, and then you'll realize that it totally makes sense that just a hard stop.
I would just go with
go.
no editing whatsoever, but Tim is a stickler for it. No, I'm just kidding.
My connection got bad. I'll see you guys later.
No, I was trying to not record in my bed because I think it's unprofessional, but it's the best Wi-Fi spot in the house.
Is your pillow properly fluffed? Do you have the comforter draped across?
Yeah. Oh, jeez.
So I want to kind of shift and ask another sort of question. I've got a phone ringing in the background, which apparently my phone this is like the fourth time it's rung during this. I did not shut my office door.
I moved locations, so, no judgment.
That's okay. I'm gonna take my shirt off. Is that a problem? It's a little toasty in here.
Oh my god, Tim, if you don't put that in, I'll kill you.
Rock flag and sweet potato gnocchi.